We got pretty much the gist of, different flaws that we're seeing with like the ping pong squat, the knees coming in, and, a decent idea of at least some of why this is going on, where people don't have the range of motion they need, they don't have the bracing mechanics that they need, and maybe they just don't have the control or experience in the movements that they need to really be effective with this.
So people are aware, there are going to be people who are really good squatters that don't check all of these boxes. So I think as people listen to this, I don't want someone to look at it and be like, oh man, they talked about someone with long femurs and, that's me. So I'm just going to not be good at squatting. Right. And so kind of tell everyone, assume because you don't check a box or two that you can't be good at squatting.
Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. Hey, it's Ben again. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training-related content to people just like you. The site features in-depth articles, movement breakdowns, and our online training program, The Protocol. And I offer one-on-one remote coaching for fitness athletes. So I hope you check it out. Head over to zorfitness.com. That's ZOAR fitness.com. See you there. And welcome back. Today's episode is a little bit different. It's a conversation that I recently had with Chris Hardenberg, and many of you might recognize his name from earlier in the podcast. I interviewed him on episode number 28, and we talked a little bit about mental toughness, movement economy, among other topics. And today we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about the breakdown that happens when people squat heavy. And just so my listeners are aware, we actually filmed this conversation as part of a guide that was published as of today, actually, on the pro membership of the website, which you will hear me mention at the beginning of the conversation. So unlike other episodes, there is a video version of this podcast on our YouTube page. And if viewing the videos is something that you guys are interested in and find additional value and enjoyment in, be sure to let us know that. You just comment on the video, and maybe we will provide more of that type of content down the road. And I will include the link to that video in the show notes if you're someone who is interested. And if not, and you're someone who just prefers to listen, really the only difference is that you're going to be missing a compilation video of my athletes squatting heavy, where there's, various types of maybe deviation or a little bit of breakdown in the movement that's happening. And that's in part what Chris and I are analyzing in this video or audio version. So when you hear us describe these things in detail, it's not really necessary for you to actually be able to view the video. Obviously, it could be helpful if you're interested in that, but it's not necessary. But I did just want to let you know that that's what we're referring to. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Chris Hardenberg.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to be doing an interview today with Chris Hardenberg. You are a remote coach and you own your own business. Is there anything you want to say about Forge Through Faith really quick?
Yeah, nothing too crazy. Forge Through Faith, obviously, we're a remote coaching business. I do a lot of stuff with terms of program design, movement analysis, nutrition. So a lot of the same stuff that you do, Ben, with your clients. So yeah, I'm excited to kind of dive in and take a look at some squats.
Awesome. Yeah. So that's the idea today, is that we're going to be going through, I'm actually going to show a bunch of videos from my clients of them squatting heavy, where there's some breakdown. And that's actually some of the idea here is kind of troubleshooting that, seeing what's going on, and then hopefully having some good interventions that we can have as well to actually help people maximize their 1RM numbers, and also just to improve the quality of their squats for longevity, because there's a number of different testing parameters that we're talking about here. One of the things that I think will probably be a helpful caveat to this conversation is saying that, let's talk about this in the context of we're trying to get people better at CrossFit. There's a lot of different ways that we could go for this. If we're only trying to get people to be good at powerlifting, we might have them low bar back squat all the time, and that might not be super helpful in the context of CrossFit. So sure. I think that's maybe a helpful thing to just say hey, we're coaching CrossFitters who are competitive. This is the goal with them. It really kind of puts helpful constraints on the conversation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So it a lot of this at any point in time, you got to kind of frame where the conversation is coming from, because, feedback in one avenue is definitely not going to be the same or as helpful as feedback in another, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. So just so people are aware of what this flow of this conversation is going to go like, we're going to show the video of the actual, well, a series of videos of people squatting. We're going to talk about what the flaws that we see, the potential causes of those flaws. And like I said, hopefully some helpful training interventions as well. So, and just so everyone's aware, this video is part of a larger series that I'm offering on the website. It's part of the Pro membership. It's going to involve not just this video that's open to the public, but also, sort of a detailed look at things that we could do to help people progress through this, kind of maybe a continuation of what we're talking about today, and then also a sample training program for someone who is having a deficit in their squatting strength for CrossFit, just so people are aware. But yeah, let's show this video and then let's dive into talking about it. And welcome back. All right, so Chris, what are some of the themes that you saw from maybe some commonalities in maybe the movement flaws in those squats?
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of the most common movement flaws you'll see in squats, and Ben, I'm sure you could elaborate on this even further. A lot of times you'll see someone's, upper back start to round, core kind of start to break down. I know the vast majority of the videos we saw were of a back squat, right? But that's especially prevalent and easy to spot in a front squat. When
the pooping dog
starts. Yeah, exactly. So that's one spot you see things start to break down. Another might be, you'll see someone's knees start to dive to the center. That's another way that'll start to break down. Sometimes you'll see somebody's weight shift too far into their heels or their butt shoot back coming out of the hole. So those are kind of some of the main ways that we'll see kind of the squat start to break down there.
And often it's a combination of those three, I think, too. Like,
sure.
I totally agree. Those are the main ones that I see. Typically it's upper back. Like oftentimes, people might to lose control of their pelvis, but often the upper back goes for a lot of people. And we can get into maybe why that is and maybe adjusting bar placement, but that's certainly one of them that I see. Yeah, people call it like the valgus knee. I don't know if it's the true valgus knee, but like basically like knees coming inside of toes, what probably a lot of people would call that. And then kind of like the adductors kicking you on as they come out of the bottom of their squat. And then, I call like that, like the hips shooting back early, the knees pushing back from where they started in the bottom of the squat, and then sort of an increased torso angle. I call that like the ping pong squat. Cause like, that's what I do a lot. Like as I'm coming out of the hole, again, my knees push back and I'm almost too far behind. And then I drive my knees forward after like my sticky point that I can get vertical again. Yeah. And personally, I feel like I've probably struggled with each of these flaws at least at some point and probably still do. Is there any of these that in particular that you can relate to?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's funny, squatting and the Olympic lifts are something I think I'm a decent coach at, and I'm terrible at performing. And so I think it's like, one of those things where you spend so much time trying to figure out the nuances behind a movement that you get better at coaching it.
Yeah.
And so, I could definitely speak to a lot of these flaws. And I know we're going to kind of dive into some of what could be contributing to some of these flaws. And I think, again, a lot of the flaws in my squats can speak to any one of the reasons behind, I kind of run the gambit there for sure.
I think, for example, we were both talking because I had an interview on the podcast. One of the things that and we both kind of agreed upon was like, double unders are like a skill that was just like super natural, like it came very naturally to us is what I mean. Sure. And it's like when you have a skill like that, like the only way that you actually end up learning how to teach those skills is because you have athletes who like continually can't learn them. Right. Where it's like if you personally don't learn a skill easily, for example, like the Olympic lifts for us, because we're not necessarily built super well for it. There's a lot of other reasons that we might not be super great squatters. Like sure. Because that's such a source of pain, so to speak, for us, we have to put so much energy into learning how to, optimize those for ourselves, but also our athletes that we're coaching as well. So It's kind of it's a helpful dynamic. Obviously, I prefer to be super great at the Olympic lifts naturally and have great positions, but that's not the way it goes. And that's not the way it goes for athletes as well that we're coaching. So it's helpful. Cool. So let's dive into each one of these a little bit more. Let's talk about anthropometrics a little bit, which I think is a super important topic. could spend a lot more talking about this. But first of all, like, what is that anthropometrics? What is that?
Yeah, so that's kind of how, essentially how your body is built, right? You know, you're going to look at people across, you know, humanity, right? But looking at CrossFit in general that are built very, very differently. You know, some people have longer limbs, some people have shorter limbs, longer torsos. Some people are tight in certain areas and for different reasons, right? And so anthropometrics is essentially, you know, how you are put together as a person, and then how, applying that to the movement perspective, you know, how you have to go about squatting because of those things.
Right. So for example, really simple one would be like femur length for squatting. That's going to be like one of the major ones that, in my opinion, is going to dictate a lot of someone's like posture and just like mechanics when they actually squat. Basically, the longer femur you have, the further distance you have between, like, as you come up, well, ideally in maybe the bottom of the squat, your joints are sort of like folded over one another, right? Where like, if this is your shin angle, this is your knee, you're coming down, and they would ideally get to maybe like 160 degrees or something, right? Like really deep in your squat. And then as you come back out of it, as these joints spread out and as you get to like sort of like parallel is what people would call it in your squat, like the distance between like your knee and your hip is bigger the longer your femur is. So it makes the mechanics of the movement so much harder. And especially if you have a short torso, it's really hard to make up the rest of that ground with, you know, being able to keep a nice upright torso. So a lot of times we see like a big torso angle increase and you can't squat as with like a nice, perfect upright torso like you see like a Chinese weightlifter. So I think femur length is certainly one thing. Is there other things that you see as important here?
Yeah, absolutely. And so femur length is huge. And that's why, you know, kind of what you touched on, people who tend to have shorter legs tend to be more natural squatters. But then other ones are going to be like really good hip internal and external rotation, especially internal rotation. So a lot of times when you get into a squat, right, as coaches, or if you've ever taken a CrossFit class, everyone talks about, you know, pushing your knees out and stuff like that. But as you get to the bottom of your squat, your femurs actually internally rotate in your hip socket. And if you are super tight in internal rotation, it's going to be hard to not only get deeper into that squat, but also to effectively drive out of that squat. All right. And that's something that I've personally struggled with. I have pretty tight hip internal rotation on my left side. And so, you know, not to be too long-winded here, but it's like, okay, I have to really work on making sure my glutes are super strong, because then your adductors look to take over, and that's definitely not what you want. So that's good hip mobility is one. And then the other one is your ankles, right? You know, people who have, I like to say the phrase, you know, people who have ski boots for ankles, where it's like there's no dorsiflexion, like squatting in any form is going to be super hard. Unless you do like you talked about, kind of alluded to previously, like that classic low bar, you know, get to parallel powerlifter squat. You know, if you have tight ankles, your knees can't track forward over your toes, which is going to make it almost impossible to keep your torso as upright. And so, you know, the main three contributors to anthropometrics, and from what I've seen, is, you know, the relationship between femur length and torso length. And you could obviously like extrapolate those out in their own right. Ankle mobility, and then also, you know, hip internal rotation.
Yeah. I think, yeah, ankle mobility is one that, like, I feel like it gets almost beat to death now.
You're right.
Like, but at the same time, it is important. If you don't have it, it's going to be just almost impossible to get into a nice upright torso squat. Like, it's like trying to do pistols and keep your heel down if you don't have ankle mobility. Like, good luck. The one thing I will say with that is, if you have great ankle mobility or great hip mobility, you don't need as much of the other. So in other words, like, if my hips are amazingly flexible and I can get into like super good hip flexion with like my knees up at my chest and good, like basically like creating separation between my feet where I can sit my hips down perfectly in between my feet, then I'm not going to need as much like forward knee travel or ankle mobility. Whereas if I have a narrower stance and a more forward toed forward versus toed out stance, same thing, like you're gonna need less hip mobility if you can use a lot of that ankle forward knee travel. So I think you can maybe get away with it a little bit if you know like, oh, I'm super flexible in one area. But if you don't have either, or you're not great in either, and you have long legs, now it's like you have the trifecta of what's going on. And yeah, welcome to our lives.
So I know, Ben, we're going to kind of go over, some of the other topics as well. But, just so people are aware, there are going to be some things that, will predispose some people to being better squatters versus not as good squatters. But, there are plenty of people who are really good squatters that don't check all of these boxes. So I think as people listen to this, I don't want someone to look at it and be like, oh man, they talked about someone with long femurs and, that's me. So I'm just going to not be good at squatting. Right. And so I like to kind of tell everyone, look at the whole package here. We're going to kind of go over some things. And again, I don't want to be too long-winded with it, but don't just assume because you don't check a box or two that you can't be good at squatting. So yeah, I mean, anthropometrics is just one part of that. Totally.
If you're someone who has, it was working on your mobility and you are working on, working with your anthropometrics to squat the best that you can, there's so much more ceiling and potential that you have. Like there's people who can squat a ridiculous amount who you would look at them and be like, why can they squat so much? Like there's a lot of I think a lot of Colombian weightlifters, if you would go to like Hook Grips, Instagram, or even just on YouTube and just search for Colombian weightlifters, a lot of them have longer femurs and still lift really effectively. I think that would be maybe a good, something to look into for people. Another thing that I think is super interesting is, and this was just sort of, I didn't have any data on this before doing some research with my athletes, but I looked at some of their front squat to deadlift ratios. So in other words, taking your front squat, taking your deadlift 1 RMs, and then dividing the front squat by the deadlift. So for example, if you have a 185 pound front squat, you have a 309 deadlift, you're at 60% for your ratio between those two, right? People who have typically shorter femurs, who are better squatters and not as good of hingers, are going to have a higher ratio there than people who are have maybe less experience squatting, who are less exposed to the front squat movement, who maybe have more of a powerlifting background or have longer femurs or are not built for it as much. They're going to have a lower deadlift percentage. And I'll put the graphic up, but you can basically see that there's a pretty wide range here. And these are just some of the athletes that I pull from that I'm working with. And also thanks to everybody who, of my clients who actually let me borrow the worst list that they have. It's like, hey, can I use this terrible, not terrible, but can I use this unideal video of you squatting? So I appreciate you sacrificing in that way. But anyway, is there anything else that from the front squat to deadlift ratios that you found interesting or anything like that?
I mean, honestly, a lot of what people will compare is front squat to back squat, right? And I'm sure if you were to do that, right, you would see the folks who have a crazy percentage front squat to deadlift probably have a crazy percentage front squat to back squat, right? Because just from a movement perspective, folks who we'll just call them longer legged individuals, right, are going to probably be better back squatters even as compared to front squat, because you can adjust a back angle and still drive through the bar on a back squat versus in a front squat, you adjust your back angle and the weight's gone, right? So you'd probably see that. And then, so that was something I was familiar with, but then to look at it compared to deadlift, I mean, some of those numbers are staggering, right? And so I think some of that is going to be anthropometrics. And like I said, a lot of the things we're going to talk out cross-sect. And, some of it could be, I don't know if the next topic is, technique, but, some of it's going to be that as well, for sure.
Yeah, totally. For example, a few of the female athletes I have on here frankly, they haven't front squatted as long as they've been deadlifting. They're newer to CrossFit, newer to weightlifting. So it's you just haven't had the reps yet. And that's something as simple as that. Okay, you need better eccentric control and, a better position on the way down so that you have a chance to actually make the lift on the way up. Which, that comes down to technique. Yeah, which again, I think a big part of just understanding how to recruit your musculature, how to, use your quads out of the hole in something like a front squat. that's just, it's reps, it's, intention. There's a lot that goes into that as well. Do you have any thoughts on the technical aspects here?
Yeah, I mean, something that, man, when it comes to either the front squat or the back squat, I think you hit the nail on the head for newer folks, right? They think that getting into the hole fast will get them out of the hole fast. And that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's because they watch people who are elite and they do get into the hole and out of the hole relatively fast. But
they like bounce almost is what it seems like.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's because they know how to effectively brace and drive on the bar.
Right.
Whereas folks who don't have those reps, not that you're doing tempo squats, but you have to lower into the hole more intentionally to be able to stay tight. And that's something I think, when it comes to technique, some of the main flaws I find that are people don't know how to maintain tension, like just core overall body tension. The best squatters, like their body is stiff, like super, you don't see any wobbling through their upper back or core. It's like their body, they have such great tension that the bar can just go straight up and down, right? So that's one. The second one is I think people, whether it's front squat or back squat, don't understand how to effectively drive through the bar. A great cue I heard a while back from a power lifter, and I don't remember who said it, but it was like through Instagram somewhere. He said he would cue his athletes to push their traps up and back through the bar when they're doing a back squat. And that was something that always stuck with me for my squats as well as people I coach. Because if you think about it, if I'm pushing my traps up and back through the bar instead of focusing on standing up, right, that's going to really help prevent that upper back rounding, because my goal is to push through the bar as opposed to just standing up.
Almost like big chest, like, thinking about not just, pushing back into the bar, but also creating upward drive through your torso as well, so that you actually maintain a little bit more rigidity.
Yeah. And that's something where and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but, I read an article on cueing and how people learn often most effectively by external versus internal cues. So using the same thing, right? We want someone to keep their chest up. So we say, hey, keep a big chest and pinch your shoulder blades together. Those are kind of internal cues because you're telling them to do something to their body, as opposed to saying, hey, we want to drive your shoulders through the bars if you're trying to touch the ceiling, right? That's external. The ceiling and the barbell are external. So those tend to elicit better results. But yeah, so those are two main flaws for sure, is being able to maintain tension and then proper pressure through the bar. I think those are probably the two biggest ones.
Yeah. I think a lot of beginners don't have good bracing mechanics, and which is a very difficult thing to explain, frankly, about how to create just a ton of 360 degrees of tension so that basically you can't, your spine's not deviating in any way, but yet you have enough, elasticity and maybe the right amount of relaxation in your hips that you can get a good rebound. Again, that's maybe not the best way to explain it, but basically a good change of direction out of the bottom of your squat as well. So there's a very interesting play of creating enough core tension where you're not allowing that deviation that we're seeing in a lot of the videos, but at the same time allowing yourself to get some speed out of the hole so that you can kind of blow past your sticky point in the squat.
Yeah. And that's definitely kind of the, like you said, maintaining that tension, I think is harder even for some experienced CrossFit athletes. And then even tougher to get that cross section between the tension and the speed, right? Louis Simmons once said, we do dynamic work because I've never seen someone squat 1,000 pounds slow, right? And the movement might not look super fast, right? But if you don't have speed, you can't best express that power, right? Or that strength. And so, oftentimes we can end up sacrificing one for the other. And so that cross section of being able to maintain that rigidity while having speed out of the hole is I think what we're all striving for sure.
Yeah. And again, the other difficult thing, if we're coaching CrossFit athletes, you don't just have to squat fast though. We were talking about this, one of the things, if you're trying to do wall balls, and you're just trying to do a really big unbroken set or something where it's not a matter of cycle speed. It's just like, hey, take your time in that movement, kind of control the descent a little bit. Like, you don't have to be super fast and explosive and be like, use your maximal strength. And actually that'll be detrimental to all of your other squatting. So the challenging thing about CrossFit is not just the fact that like we need to teach bracing mechanics and rigidity and strength in all these patterns, but we also have to be able to translate that, or maybe not translate it, but maybe have a completely separate skill set for squatting patterns in other avenues. Like a Metcon squat of 65-pound thrusters is completely different than your max front squat.
Mm-hmm. Even doing Olympic lifts in a workout, right? Like we talk about bracing. Well, if you're bracing in every squat clean in a Metcon, yeah, exactly. Like you would for a heavy back squat, your heart rate
30% of your max. Yeah.
Yeah. And now you're totally out of breath. Right. And so, yeah, that also makes it difficult trying to, run the spectrum of all of those skills for sure.
Yeah. We could probably spend, as we said, much more on this. But I think we got pretty much the gist of, a lot of these different flaws that we're seeing with like the ping pong squat, the knees coming in, and, a decent idea of at least some of why this is going on, where people don't have the range of motion they need, they don't have the bracing mechanics that they need, and maybe they just don't have the control or experience in the movements that they need to really be effective with this. So let's move on to maybe some of the training interventions that we could do. This could be as simple as, hey, they need to squat more often and do that for a long period of time and do some focused mobility work, or we could get into specific protocols. Obviously, like you have your own athletes that you're working with, so not necessarily talking specifically about the videos that we watch now, but just in general with athletes that we see a lot in CrossFit. Like, what are some basic guidelines that you could give somebody that you think would probably help improve their maximal squat strength or in heavy squats and the amount of breakdown they have, trying to minimize that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is, and again, right, why the squat's breaking down could be a cross section of all these things, but looking at maybe like, okay, well, what is preventing me from being a better squatter, and then doing the necessary things to attack that area. So like, for example, let's say you have good anthropometrics, you have decent mobility, you've been doing this for a little while, but you're just weak, right? Like, hey, I just don't have strong quads or glutes. Then it's, doing targeted accessory work in conjunction with your squat program is going to go a long way to getting strong. That's why if you go and watch like the Chinese weightlifters, right? And weightlifting, watching weightlifters squat is going to be more conducive to CrossFit or better carryover than, watching a massive powerlifter,
yeah.
right? So, but if you take a look at how those guys look, they just have so much quad meat. It's just like a small person could stay dry from the rain by hiding under their VMO. Like, it's crazy. And so like being able to have super strong quads is going to go a long way. So that's one avenue, right? The other one is like, okay, let's say your technique is not there, right? Like the quote strength is there because, okay, by our accessory work or whatever the case is, there's other metrics to look at. Plus by just looking at you, it's like, okay, like we're decently strong, but we're breaking down because of this flaw, right? Well, if it's neuromuscular or it's skill-based, a lot of it is going to be based on like doing more reps and cueing them effectively. And then there's certain things you could do or certain drills you could do to help with those things, right? Like, for example, you might have someone who rounds their back a lot in a front squat. You've cued them until the cows come home. And so what you do is you say, yeah, right. So what you do is you say, all right, we're going to throw in something like a zombie squat, right? Where it's like, okay, now I'm getting physical feedback every time my back rounds, and I have to find and feel how to effectively drive it. Because if you're not familiar, a zombie squat, you set up like a front squat. Yep, the bar sits on your chest, and you let go with your hands and keep them straight. And if you have really bad back posture, it is next to impossible to perform that squat. Yeah, exactly. It's gone. So obviously squatting more, cueing effectively will help those folks, but also finding drills to kind of like okay, let's put you in the position where things break down and, basically force you to feel your way through that. And then, if it is anthropometric based, and let me say this, anthropometric based in a way that we can actually change, then targeted mobility work is effective, and not just like stretching, right? Stretching and lacrosse balling. That's what I would call passive mobility work, where I'm pushing my joints into that range of motion. But I find that two things. One, not only is that mobility less sticky, like it sticks around less,
definitely,
but also transfers over to the movement less. So you have to combine that with like, for example, like a Cossack squat is like a great example of active mobility, right? Like you're going into that range of motion in a way that you have to still actively move through it. So combining those things is super helpful. And I say things you can change because, like, let's go to the long femur thing. Like there's no like femur shortening. Or,
if there was,
Yeah. Or like, for example, like I have a super tight left ankle, right?
Yeah.
And I spent years mobilizing it, going to chiropractors, adhesion removal, and just could not get that sucker to move. And I think a lot of it was due to like a really bad sprained ankle I had in high school that I didn't let heal effectively. And now it's just like, it's jammed up in there. And, it's like, okay, well, I've spent years actually trying to get this thing to move more, and it's not moving more. So I'm not going to waste my time anymore. But if you are able to make improvements there, that's another way to do it, I would say.
Yeah. And I've actually experienced that with a number of people where it's just like the ankle comes up against end range, like whether they've had an ankle injury or they've just been they've been down that road many times. Like they know if I do that and I continue to push it, it's just going to aggravate it and make things worse rather than better. Yeah. Like don't just kind of continue to beat down that door. Like try to go a little bit of a different direction with it and change the way that you squat a little bit. Yeah. I really like that. One of the things that personally I try to think about is like, if I just give this person squats, are they going to get better? Like if the answer is yes, like just give them the squats and let them squat for a while. And like, that could be the simplest thing that you could possibly do. Like, hey, we need to squat with high intention, or maybe it's involving like tempos or pauses, things like where you're having to increase the level of engagement in not just like muscular engagement, but also like with your brain too, like giving them cues to think about when they're actually squatting and slowly manipulating their form that they're doing their squatting with over a period of time. Because a lot of people, I think, have a little bit more range than they could probably claim a little bit more range than they're actually using when they're squatting.
Sure.
So for example, like I could have my knees a little bit further forward while keeping my heels down in my front squats most of the time when I'm training. And yet I don't a lot of times, right? So it's like, if I really focused on it, I could probably improve that a little bit. And if I do that over the course of 6 months, like my front squat's probably gonna be a little bit better because I can keep my torso a little bit more vertical. So I think sometimes it just comes down to like, hey, you need more consistent exposure, focusing on the right things. And then we can then begin, as you said, to couple that with other accessory movements or mobility work that's actually gonna help augment the adaptation you're getting out of your squat from doing those other things. Yeah, so I think like if I just use a personal example, like, or again, I've seen this with a lot with the videos that we watched before, is when you come out of the bottom of your squat, the knees push back, right? So like you started out in your squat, and if this is my foot, my knee was over top of my toe. And then at a certain point, as you're coming out, rather than that staying forward and the hips driving straight up, the knees push back and the hips push back, and then you're trying to save it again. So one of the things to work on is keeping those knees over the toe for a longer period of time. So that can be, number one, as I said, just like focusing on it in the eccentric, like think, okay, knees forward as I'm, hips obviously are coming back, but knees got to stay forward. And then as I come out of the hole, really think about keeping the knees driven forward, almost as if you were pushing them against a wall or something. Which is like one of those external cues that you were talking about, right? Like keep those knees forward, like you're pushing them against something. And then again, you can think about driving up from there. And like, that's a simple thing where if you focus on that for a period of time, maybe you do some directed ankle mobility work, and you also do some, hip flexion, like L sits or something like that, where you're thinking about maintaining your hip flexion as that's only going to help the bottom of your squat as you come out to prevent that kickback from happening. So right. I think maybe some examples like that are all simple ways that you could start to incorporate not just squatting, not just mobility work, or not just accessories, but starting to integrate them into something that's a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit less elementary than just, hey, squat more, or, do this squat cycle.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think where people run into problems is they fall too far onto one of those things, and I was definitely that person at one point, right? Like some of my education background is through the OPEX line of thinking, and they're like very like accessory exercise heavy. And so like I fell into that bucket, and slowly over time realized it was like, man, if we're going to get better at this, like we just got to do it.
Yeah.
And there's so many variables you can manipulate within the squat itself to get people better at squatting. Like you said, tempo or pauses, or, squatting without lift, taking your lifters off, squatting barefoot, a zombie squat. Like there's so many different variables that you could manipulate, which then forces people to focus on those things. Like you mentioned, and we'll stay on that, the knees tracking forward and the chest driving up. Like folks who have a hard time with that, I go to pauses a lot, because now there's no temptation to get that extra bounce out of the hole and shoot your hips back. It's like, hey, we're going to hang out down here. You're going to get comfortable down there, and then you're going to figure out how to effectively drive out, because now you can't utilize that stretch reflex to overcome your poor technique. And so if you're sitting in the bottom and your hips shoot straight back, now you have almost no shot of squatting that front squat. So I think being able to utilize all those tools in your toolbox is going to be super effective.
Yeah. And then I guess the last thing would be like, you don't know what you don't know. So work with a coach. Like that's what we do full time. It's something that, like if you want to understand your squat in a way that you currently don't understand it, you can't teach yourself. I mean, you can teach yourself, and hopefully you are continuing to teach yourself, but at the same time, like you're going to accelerate your rate of improvement if you can work with somebody who has helped people through your situation or a very similar situation to that before. So I'll add that little anecdote.
Heck yeah, man.
Hey, Chris, thank you for doing this today.
Hey, you got it, Ben. Thanks for chatting.
Hey, it's Ben again. Thanks for listening today. And recently I've gotten a few questions about my plans for the podcast moving forward, like, will you be releasing more episodes? Yes, I like the seasonal format a lot because it allows me to reflect, to recoup, and kind of plan the upcoming season. But yes, I do have season 3 planned to come out in 2022. And graciously, I've had some people ask how they can support the podcast further. And, I could put some of the episodes behind a paywall, but frankly, I got into coaching because I actually wanted to help people and help them, actualize their athletic potential, let's call it. And I don't know, some part of me feels aligned when I give away some of my best work for free. But that being said, there are definitely some things that you can actually do to support the show. Number one would just be to rate the podcast, right? Like most platforms have the ability to give, the show like a star rating, like up to 5 stars would be best. And Apple, if you listen on Apple, there's an option to write a review as well. And, honestly, a positive rating or a truthful review is something that is really going to be helpful for other athletes and coaches in the space actually finding the show. It's just, an important part of it. So that's one thing you can do is rate and review the podcast. Number 2 is that you could follow us on socials. I actively post a lot of unique content to Instagram, YouTube, and also our email list. So those 3 are really the ones I would encourage people to go to. You can follow us on Instagram at Zor Fitness. You can subscribe on YouTube. Again, just search Zor Fitness. And you can also get on the email list if you just go to zorfitness.com. There's a nice big spot on the homepage where you can sign up there. So number 1 would be to rate or review the podcast. Number 2 would be to follow us on socials. Number 3 would be to sign up for Pro. Pro is $29 a month, and that's going to open up about a decade's worth of programming and enough educational articles to keep you occupied for, let's just say, a very long time. And so today's episode was actually published as an element of one of the Pro articles on the website. If you want to dive deeper into today's topic, troubleshooting squats and how to write program design for them, and just kind of see what else is on Pro as well, be sure to head over to zorfitness.com/pro, and you can sign up for a free trial if you'd like. And until next time, I appreciate y'all listening. And as always, stay the course.